introduce you, Mark.
Go ahead. Please do.
This is Mark Devlin. This is Truth Seekers North East, and he's doing a talk about James Bond. Now, if you could just put your phones on silent and save any questions you've got till the end.
We're doing a two-parter, yeah, with a break in the middle?
Yes, we'll have a break in the middle. There's soup, there's tea, scones, biscuits. These are going to be jam-packed full. You're going to have a lie down by the time we're finished. I hope you know that. So we're going to go... Right, I'll leave it to you, Mark.
Right, thank you. Well, first of all, sorry I'm late. I always get lost when I come up north. I didn't have a sat-nav last time, and this time it sent me all around Gateshead. I was doing the Get Carter tour. But, I got here in the end. So, the last time I was up here, can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Yeah, don't want to speak too loud, you know. Guy next door. Last time I was up here, I did a talk based around COVID. Don't know about you though, but I'm heartily sick of COVID bollocks by now. Living and breathing and talking it day in, day out. So I thought it might be nice on this occasion to leave all of that to the side and focus on something different. So this will hopefully be some welcome distraction from all the crap that we have in our lives now. And we're going into the realm of James Bond and Ian Fleming. And the reason I've chosen to do a presentation on this is because I've been a lifelong James Bond fan, or at least I was until I woke up and came to realise that it's full of dark occult symbolism and mind control propaganda, just like the music industry. But until I came to those realisations, I was a big fan of the original Ian Fleming novels and then the movie series that was based around them. And I first got into the James Bond stories when I was at school. There was a small group of us that got into Ian Fleming's original novels. And we all thought we were really cool because the novels were very edgy and gritty and very adult. And we were about 13 at the time, and we just thought we were so cool to be into this subversive kind of material. And the Ian Fleming books are actually very different to most of the movie treatments. And in my view, they're much more cinematic. And if the novels were made into films, with the narrative following the original story, they'd make for some very interesting films. A lot of them would be very kind of art house and very different to the mass market blockbusters that we do have. But I've put together this presentation based around the creator of the James Bond stories, Ian Fleming, because his story is every bit as interesting as James Bond's himself. And James Bond was very much based around Ian Fleming. It was very much an autobiographical thing for him. So a good place to start, we have a two-parter with a break halfway. When it comes to the movies, it would appear to be the opening credit sequence, which is very distinctive to the James Bond films, where you get this gun barrel sequence. You have James Bond, whichever actor is playing it at the time, walking across the screen. You get the view from the point of view of a would-be assassin who's seen to be looking down a gun barrel. And then just before he gets the chance to fire, Bond turns around and fires at him, and you get the blood coming down the screen. One thing that struck me about this, just skipped one there, is there's different interpretations of the gun barrel logo. But if you look at this version of it, what you appear to have encoded when you've entrained yourself to look for such things is a 666. You have 3 sixes spiralling around the gun barrel there. And this is just a different interpretation of that. This immediately put me in mind of some symbolism in the last video from Paul McCartney, or whoever it is, for his song called, now what was this one called? It was from his last album, Egypt Station. And I forget the name of the song, but anyway, this is the video for it. And it's absolutely laden with trauma-based mind control symbolism. This is all stuff that I've trained myself to look for through my music industry research. He's got the butterfly brooch thing going on there, and monarch butterflies are very symbolic of monarch programming as part of MK Ultra, trauma-based mind control, which is absolutely prolific throughout the entertainment industry. Many music artists display symbolism pertaining to trauma-based mind control because many of them have been through that as a condition of them being gifted a career. So here we've got a lifelong career individual in the form of Paul McCartney, and in his last video you've got these spirals going on here, which is also indicative of mind control and the dissociation from reality which occurs through those methods. So we have more of that in the gun barrel sequence here. And another interpretation that you might want to put on this is that if you use a little bit of imagination, this icon becomes a little bit like a sort of reptilian eye. And in the next slide, if you compare the two side by side, there's possibly some overtones of a sort of reptilian eye going on there, which becomes very interesting to factor in if you consider the work of David Icke, for instance. But anyway, that's some symbolism to get us started. So the creator of the James Bond stories was Ian Lancaster Fleming, and he was born in 1908 into an aristocratic family. So he was pretty much of elite bloodline stock. He was educated at a couple of the same institutions as his fictional character James Bond, as we'll see. His father was this guy, Valentine Fleming, and he was killed in action during World War I. His father, in turn, Ian Fleming's grandfather, was the head of a banking dynasty, which had been around for several generations by that point. And the current incarnation of this is Stonehenge Fleming. And it gives you some of the history with a heritage dating back to 1873 and a sixth generation family at our core. So that's the family that Ian Fleming came out of. Very much established within the British establishment infrastructure. This was his brother Peter Fleming, who worked as a journalist and also a banker and had great success in these different careers in his time. And Ian Fleming in turn got into newspaper journalism before he got into espionage, as we'll see. So one of the places where Ian Fleming was educated was Eton Public School, which is where all the prime ministers go. You know, Boris Johnson was educated / indoctrinated there, same thing with David Cameron. Most of the prime ministers and prominent politicians get churned out of Eton. It's very much an establishment elite breeding ground. So that's where Fleming got his first education. Then he went on to Sandhurst Military Academy, which is also a very familiar career path for many of these establishment types. And these are attributes that he gave to his character of James Bond, who is said to have attended these same institutions. So things get really interesting with Ian Fleming's career when we hit World War II. So after Eton's Sandhurst, he got sent out to Munich for a time and also to Zurich. And he studied at universities there, learned some languages and took up various pursuits out there. But then we had the advent of World War II, and Ian Fleming was drafted into naval intelligence. So he worked in the Admiralty at that time. And he was second in command to the Admiral Godfrey, who was his commanding officer. And he got involved in some very top secret intelligence missions. And so here we have the beginnings of the background of his character James Bond, because many of the exploits of that fictional character were based on things that Fleming himself had experienced. So I've got a little piece of interview footage here from way back, where Fleming is talking about the whole concept of espionage and the view that he has on that profession. If we have the sound.
Any trade, and we all know it. Khrushchev said so, and so has Alan Dulles.
Well, why do you think that a hero who engages in a dirty trade and leads a basically dirty life has become so popular with the viewing public?
Well, it's very difficult to say. I think because perhaps the books have pace and plenty of action.
Still here okay?
Yeah.
And espionage is not regarded by the majority of the public as a dirty trade. They regard it rather as sort of a very romantic affair, you know, since the first days when the spies from the other side lifted up the tent flap and listened to the plans of the Arab chieftains and tried to get away with it. Spying has always been regarded as a very romantic one-man job. It's been one man against the whole police force or an army.
Do you feel there's a need for heroes, extravagant heroes like James Bond?
I've got many heroes in my life. I mean, people like Winston Churchill and heaven knows how many other people I've met during the war. And I think that although they may have feet of clay, we probably all have, and all human beings have, and there's no point in dwelling entirely on the feet. There are many other parts of the animal that could be examined. And I think that people like to read about heroes.
Mr. Fleming, in your book there's a great amount of detail. Is this detail based on personal experience? You make it up? Where does it come from?
Well, I can say it's 90% from personal experience, really, and I wouldn't say the espionage detail is, because although I worked in naval intelligence during the war and got mixed up in a lot of shenanigans, of course, if I started sticking too close to the true espionage work of today, I should be in trouble with the Official Secrets Act in England, even supposing I had access to information. So a lot of the espionage detail is either invented or taken from very often cases which have been brought between, let's say, the West Germans and the Russians, the KGB.
So for some reason the video is slightly out of sync with the audio there. Seems to have slipped, but I'm sure you get the gist. As you can hear, he was terribly posh, and he spoke of espionage in none too flattering terms. He said, you know, the public thinks of it as very romantic and dashing and thrilling, but actually it's a very dirty business, and he was quite derogatory about it. He described his creation, James Bond, as a blunt instrument for the British government. That's the way he saw him. And he talks there of not crossing that line when it comes to the Official Secrets Act. So there's only so much that he can put out there under the guise of fiction, and there comes a point where he would start breaching his disclosure agreements if he put too much detail into his stories. So there's a lot of fictional embellishments into his stories, but much of it is based on missions that he himself underwent, as far as he's able to get away with talking about it. The interesting thing is that there were a couple of other British authors who were contemporaries of Ian Fleming's, who also had backgrounds in the intelligence services and were used as assets of them. And one of them was Roald Dahl, here on the left, of Tales of the Unexpected fame, and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and all that good stuff. Roald Dahl actually wrote the screenplay for the film version of Ian Fleming's You Only Live Twice, and he also was involved in writing the screenplay for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which was an Ian Fleming story, incredibly. That was when he took a bit of a break from his James Bond stories. Fleming put out the book Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, a children's adventure story about this flying car with amazing powers. And in the film version of that, you have the character of the child catcher, who is basically a child sex trafficker of his day, because he went around grabbing children and putting them in the back of a van and driving off with them. The child catcher was portrayed by Russell Brand in the opening ceremony of the 2012 London Olympics, which was absolutely laden with dark occult symbolism. But interestingly, in the original novel version of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, there was no child catcher. That character was added for the screen treatment, which was done at the hands of Roald Dahl. And then, as well as Ian Fleming and Roald Dahl, another author with connections into British military intelligence was Dennis Wheatley, known for his occult stories. The best known one is probably The Devil Rides Out. And his daughter, Maria Wheatley, is actually very active on the crop circle scene. She does a lot of talks at Glastonbury and...
No, they're different.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
serious. Because I followed that.
I was informed that it was his daughter.
It's a different one.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a pity because it would be great.
I stand corrected in that case then, but yeah, I was told that was the case. Alright then, so this is Dennis Wheatley of The Devil Rides Out fame. So you've got 3 British authors here who all have connections into the intel services. And you've got to wonder at what point their creation of ostensibly fictional stories ends, and at what point they're disclosing things that really do go down. Another character that we can throw into this very interesting mix is Aleister Crowley, the notorious British occultist. Whenever I do a talk on the music industry, it's never too long before Crowley pops up. And if we were ever doing a drinking game, most people would be under the table by the end of one of these presentations with every mention of his name. So the reason he comes into this story is that very late on in his life, Crowley died in December 1947, apparently a broken man and penniless in a boarding house in Hastings. But during the Second World War, he was attached to Ian Fleming's department in naval intelligence, and he was used as an intelligence asset. And he was bringing some of his occult insights to bear in terms of drawing up military strategies and how certain missions might best be achieved. So isn't that an interesting mix? And according to some, Ian Fleming worked as, or served as, the handler of Crowley when he was attached to naval intelligence during those years. Just throwing this in as a matter of interest, going back to the music industry again very briefly, the Pet Shop Boys put out a movie in 1987 called It Couldn't Happen Here, and their version of Always On My Mind was included in that movie. And in the video for it, you get the actor Joss Ackland playing this very eccentric character. And to me, it looks very much as if he might have been modelled on Crowley, because there's definitely a similarity going on there. And it's never actually revealed that that's who he's supposed to be portraying, but I suspect that it's him that's being referenced here. And when we come to the first Ian Fleming James Bond novel, which was Casino Royale, put out in 1953, you have a description in Fleming's own words of the villain from that story, a character by the name of Le Chiffre, French for the cipher. And he's the first adversary that Bond finds himself up against. And according to Fleming's own description, Le Chiffre seems to bear some physical resemblance to Aleister Crowley, which has led some to suspect that he based the entire character on his experiences of working with Crowley during the Second World War. We get the same suspicion when it comes to the character portrayed by Charles Gray, who would later go on to play Blofeld in the Diamonds Are Forever movie, James Bond movie. But we're going back now to a Dennis Wheatley story, probably his best known, The Devil Rides Out. There was a film version of that, which came out in 1967. And Charles Gray is portraying this black sorcerer, this black magician. And it's believed that his character in that film was very much based around Aleister Crowley as well. And The Devil Rides Out is a very unsettling film. It's pretty scary stuff, you know, particularly when you come to realise how much of what's in the narrative probably really does go on. In The Devil Rides Out, one of the central characters is portrayed by Christopher Lee, who would later go on to play a James Bond villain also. He portrayed Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun. But it also turns out, when you do a bit of delving into genealogy of Ian Fleming, that he and Christopher Lee are cousins. So I find this all the time in my research into the music industry and with the book that I'm researching now. Family bloodlines are key to so much. And whenever you have people that are in the public eye, whether it's as a musician or an actor or a politician or any other role that gives them influence over large numbers of people in society, you often find out that their prominent position is not left to chance. They are placed there because of the families and the bloodlines that they come out of. And there are just so many examples of this. So going on to the Fleming novels then, this is the full canon of his works, and it kicked off with Casino Royale in 1953, by which point Fleming was into his 40s and he just married for the first time. We'll get on to who he married shortly, but he stated that to take his mind off the trauma and the shock of getting married so late in life, as it was considered back then, he decided to throw himself into the writing of fiction for the first time. And he had this idea of creating this character James Bond, largely based upon his own experiences and exploits. And so he settled into a routine where he had a house specially built for himself in Jamaica, and the house was called GoldenEye, which was later to become the title of one of the James Bond films. And he would base himself out in Jamaica from January to March of each year. And he would spend those 3 months writing the novel that he had in his head. then for the rest of the year he would come back to London, where he had various connections to newspapers of the time. He used to write newspaper columns and articles for the Times, I think it was, back in London. And then he would plan the next novel. The one that he'd written earlier that year would get published towards the end of the year, and then the following January he'd go back to GoldenEye and write the next book. And that pattern, that routine, was kept in his life up until his death in 1964. So he died at a relatively young age of 56. He was a lifelong smoker, he liked to drink or two, and he got diagnosed with heart problems, heart disease, which basically finished him off. And many of these attributes he gave to Bond as well. He was very keen on certain brands of expensive cigarettes, and he liked the same drinks as Fleming, so whenever you see Bond ordering a drink in one of these stories, that was one of Fleming's own favourite tipples. And Fleming was also a notorious womaniser, which is also a trait that he gave to James Bond. There was a very interesting book that came out a few years ago by the author Philip Gardner, and he was considering the possibility that Fleming, who was very well studied in occult arts, may have been into the concept of alchemy, of changing states of consciousness and changing states of being. And he made a very interesting observation that when you look at all the Bond stories, whether it's the original novels or when they were turned into films, Bond always links up with a leading lady, so there's always a Bond girl. And this was a pattern that was established by Fleming, it wasn't just invented for the cinematic versions. And so Gardner is positing the idea that James Bond is only seen to overcome the adversary, the enemy, his male opponent, when he joins forces with whoever the leading lady of the story is. So he needs that feminine principle of care to be married with the masculine principle of action. And it's only when those two values are brought together that it creates the alchemical whole, which gives Bond what he needs to defeat the evil of the villain, which I think is a very interesting way of looking at it. We have some curious imagery when it comes to some of the promotional photos. This picture appeared on the back cover of many of the original Fleming novels when they were published by Jonathan Cape back in the 50s and 60s. And you can see half his face is in shadow there, which brings to mind the idea of the shadow self, doing shadow work on the ego of one's own personality and consciousness, going into the realms of occult studies again. And it's very similar to the image that we had on the first Beatles album coming out in 1963, where half of the band members' faces are in shadow as well. So it's bringing to mind the concept of duality, of dark and light, and these opposing values in nature. So it's all, you know, occult ideas that appear to have been encoded into some of this work. So this is GoldenEye, this is Fleming's house in Jamaica, and I've got a little piece of interview next for a TV feature that was done on Fleming shortly before his death, and we'll see what he's got to say in this.
He brought out a rubber stamp and a red ink pad. M opened the pad, tapped the rubber stamp on it, and then carefully pressed it down on the grey cover. He turned the docket round and pushed it gently across the desk to Bond. The red sans serif letters, still damp, said, "For your eyes only." Silenced last week was one of the busiest and most successful typewriters of recent years when Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond, died in England at the age of 56 following a heart attack. Ian Fleming's name first appeared on the bookstands in 1953 with the first of Bond's adventures, Casino Royale, which he had begun to write at the age of 44. After that, startling things happened. More than 32 million copies of his 14 books were sold, earning him a fortune of close to $3 million. 12 million copies.
I'm sure that stopped. Interesting. Okay, well that's the abridged version, evidently. Don't really know why it stopped. But anyway, this is Fleming's wife. This is the woman he married, Anne Rothermere, as she was known. And prior to getting with Fleming, she was the wife of Lord Rothermere, who was the proprietor of the Daily Express at the time. So, as I mentioned, Fleming was a bit of a womaniser, and he was carrying on an affair with Anne, and this got discovered, and it led to her divorce from Lord Rothermere, and then she got together with Fleming. And as he says, that's what the whole experience inspired him to create his James Bond stories. They had one son together, Caspar Fleming. Here he is, and tragically he took his own life in 1975, and he died on Ian Fleming's birthday. A bit of family tragedy going on there. And this woman was known as Blanche Blackwell, and she was part of the British sort of expat community in Jamaica at the time, going back to those colonial days. Fleming is said to have had an affair with her while he was living in Jamaica, while he was still married to Anne. Anne also is said to have had an affair and cheated on Fleming with somebody else, so that's just how these elites like to get down, you know. And Blanche turns out to be the mother of Chris Blackwell, who was the proprietor of Island Records.
Yeah.
And Island Records is arguably the best known record label when it comes to reggae music. So that was the label of Bob Marley and the Wailers, and many other prominent reggae musicians. So a lot of reggae fans that I've spoken to have always found it very suspicious that the #1 label within that genre was owned by a white British establishment member, you know, of the elite class. And many people within the reggae community have suspected that Chris Blackwell was something of a gatekeeper, that that whole genre, that whole scene was controlled. They wanted to keep a lid on it, they wanted to be in control of how far it went, and then you can factor in what happened to Bob Marley with all of that, which is something for a talk of another day. But Chris Blackwell's mother was Blanche Blackwell, who Ian Fleming was romantically involved with, so there's connections all over the place. And when it comes to the original character of James Bond, Fleming always said that he wanted a name for his hero that was going to be memorable and impactful, but wasn't going to be too over the top. He wanted it to be in many ways very mundane and very ordinary. And this was a book that used to grace his coffee table in Goldeneye in Jamaica, called Birds of the West Indies, by an author called James Bond. And this is him.
Yeah.
He's not really many people's idea of the super spy James Bond, but that's the original guy from where we got the name. So the first novel, Casino Royale, which in my opinion is the best. It was a very simple, straightforward spy story, but it really had impact, and it's very cinematic in the way it was presented, and in my view it remains the best of the novels, just in terms of its sheer story value. So James Bond's code number within the Secret Service was always 007, and it turns out that wasn't a fictional invention of Fleming's. That goes all the way back to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I in the 1500s, and this statesman that she kept by her side by the name of John Dee. So he was an astrologer, an occultist, and so many other things, and he used to advise Queen Elizabeth on strategies, military strategies and such, based on his occult insights and visions and such. So he was very well studied and a very complex character. He used to sign his letters to Queen Elizabeth 007, which was a code name that he attributed to himself, and he would often put in the letters "For Your Eyes Only," which is where that title of the James Bond story came from centuries before. So according to this, Dee often corresponded with the Queen on confidential matters, took to signing his letters 007. The zeros represented eyes, and the 7 was thought to be a lucky number that offered protection. Many scholars believe that Dee was one of Elizabeth's spies, and that his travels throughout Europe were not for spiritual conferences, but rather to gather intelligence. So it's the very early days of the intelligence services. And according to this quote from the very well-known Freemason and student of occult arts, or master of the occult arts, I guess, Manly Palmer Hall, talking about Freemasonry specifically. He said, when the Mason learns that the key to the warrior on the block is the proper application of the dynamo of living power, he has learnt the mastery of his craft. He must follow in the footsteps of his forefather, Tubal Cain, who with the mighty strength of the war god hammered his sword into a ploughshare. We're getting into the realms of Freemasonry here, and we're getting into a biblical character known as Tubal Cain, who appears to have been adopted by the Freemasonic community as something of an emblem. This is where we get ties back into the emblem, the logo, the number of 007. So, according to this guy, William Unpronounceable, a former Mason, who I quoted in my last book, he was something of a whistleblower that went on a bunch of podcast interviews to talk about some of the inner secrets of the Masons. And in one of his interviews, he stated, "For Masons who wish to conceal their membership from non-Masons, but still advertise it to their lodge brothers, there is a special pin or tie tack that they can wear. It looks like an upside-down golf club with two balls near the top. This is called the two-ball cane and is a pun on the secret password of a master Mason, Tubal Cain." So, looking at it from a kind of base, smutty point of view, what you have is two balls and a cane, which is going into sort of phallic symbology. But what has also been identified by some is the modern day Facebook logo. Also seems to resemble the cane, the arched cane there, and the two balls, which also appear in the 007 logo when you turn it to the side. And it all appears to tie back into the idea of this character of Tubal Cain, who is very much connected to Masonic ritual. Interesting to consider that, because Fleming would almost certainly have been a Mason, given his connections. I've not uncovered any documentation to prove this is the case, but I would be very surprised to discover that he wasn't. There is a website called Literary Bond, and it has some artist sketches on it where they've drawn upon the original descriptions that Ian Fleming gave to various characters in the book, and they've drawn what the character should look like based on the way Fleming described him. And when it comes to James Bond himself, this is an artist's impression of how Fleming envisaged him. And Fleming did state that he'd modelled his appearance very much on a very well-known American singer and actor of the time called Hoagy Carmichael. So this is Hoagy Carmichael on the right, and Bond is said to somewhat resemble him. And here's Fleming again talking about his idea of Bond as a blunt instrument. He's basically an order follower in the service. So this is something that kind of came to my realisation in more recent years when I got into the workings of natural law and spiritual principles and this kind of thing, and right action, morality. James Bond is effectively what you could describe accurately as an order follower. So he's someone who takes orders from somebody perceived to be his superior, and he carries them out without question. He doesn't scrutinise whether these actions represent morality or right action or whether they can be justified. He just does what he's told. And in most cases that involves going out and killing people. So he kills people on somebody else's say-so. And you can make all kinds of excuses for that, and you could cite all kinds of circumstances in which that might take place. But under natural spiritual law, if you commit the act of killing another living being, you're bringing that karmic burden, that consequence on yourself. It doesn't matter that somebody else told you to do it. You're the one that put that act into physical manifestation. So you carry the karmic can for that. And so I came to realise in more recent years that James Bond is basically an order follower, and there is nothing moral or noble about an order follower who doesn't question whether an action represents right action before he carries it out. And the same thing can also be said for his colleague. So in the early books and also in the film series, James Bond would often get together with a CIA agent by the name of Felix Leiter. and he's been portrayed by many different actors in the film series. Here are some of them. But Felix Leiter pops up in many of these James Bond stories, and the same attributes can be applied to a CIA agent as to a British MI5, MI6 Secret Service agent. You know, they also are order followers. And when it comes to the history of the CIA, I've got an interview next week actually, which I'm putting out as a podcast, with the director of a new movie called 1,000 Pieces. It's a documentary film about the CIA with elements of the FBI going into it as well. The guy's name is Richard Rogers, and the title of the movie, 1,000 Pieces, is a reference to the famous quote made by President John F. Kennedy, where he spoke of his wish to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. And very shortly after he made that comment, he just happened to be assassinated. So even as far back as 1963, at which point the CIA had only been in existence for 15 years or so, it was criminal and it was corrupt and it was in breach of its charter in so many different cases. And of course it's only so much worse now, particularly when you get into MK Ultra, that very far-reaching mind control program coming out of the CIA, and with the FBI you had COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, which is where they planted many of their agents in political activist movements to kind of smoke out these troublemakers. And again, we get some links into the music industry there with the likes of Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon and Bob Marley, who were all embroiled in that COINTEL program. So there's nothing noble, there's nothing gracious, there's nothing to be admired about any of these intelligence services, because they all overstep the mark and they all go way beyond what they were ostensibly set up to do. They're populated by criminals. There's a great song by the group The Fugs called CIA Man, which sums it up nicely. And a lyric that I love, particularly from my research into the counterculture of the 60s and all the stuff that went on there, is the lyric, "Who can take the sugar from its sack, pour in LSD and put it back? Fucking A, man, CIA man." Some truth right there. This is a shorter chat than most of mine, so I've got much more in part 2, but this is actually the break. So let's all have a few refreshments. We don't clap, do we? So keep it quiet.